Eddie Bernice Johnson for the 30th District of Texas. So he is running for Congress in an effort to defeat Eddie Bernice Johnson. So, Dr. Pennie, thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thank you for having me on.
Now, Eddie Bernice Johnson was elected in 1992. She's been in this seat for a long time. She's 84 years old, and so she's done this for a long time. But when the elections come up, she typically gains between 70 and 80%. And I think in 2018 she had like 91% of the vote. So she seems to be popular in the district. But she covers most of South Dallas, which tends to be a lower income area, and that nothing seems to change there. And that raises the question of why do people keep voting for her in an area where things don't seem to change? And Donald Trump raised this issue back around in the 2016 election. He said, why do you keep supporting people who don't seem to be making a difference for you? So why are you running against her?
Well, the simplest answer to all of this is that they haven't had any candidates, any other legitimate candidates to really take her off, right? From my perspective, I mean, someone who's who come from this type of community, this is indicative of what we see all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We get these lifelong congressional candidates and Democrat. If you think about most of the failing districts, right? We talk about the major minority districts. 28% of the 435 House seats in the United States Congress are major minority districts, and most of them have Democrat leadership in place. All those failing districts have somewhat of the same mechanisms in place. They don't have because of the way that they were drawn, the way they were gerrymandered. They were specifically garnered so they can go after these minority votes, and they use certain type of rhetoric to where they make people believe that they're going to give them something, right? So the progressive policies that have kept us in the ghettos for so many years, those are the things that they use to continue to sell us on reelecting them.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in the inner city of Houston, Texas, and like I said, same type of impoverished community. The representatives that have been in office there, Sheila Jackson Lee, been there forever. Look, we've been victimized at extreme rates during the period that I was coming up, and it's still happening right now. The same, low economic development, failing schools, high crime. I mean, this is indicative of what happens in these communities.
Now, in years past, the cities in Texas were generally red. They oftentimes had Republicans, sometimes Democratic mayors, but it was red or reddish or at least purple. And Dallas was not that long ago. And yet, over the past, I would say, 10 years or so, it seems like the major cities in Texas have turned bright blue, and yet the rest of the state stays bright red. What's happening? Is this just Democratic success? What's happening to make the cities so blue? And it's not just in Texas. That's pretty much around the country.
Look, this is the thing, and I think I've been talking about this for a long time. Essentially, the Republican Party doesn't have an infrastructure in any of these districts, right, that are heavy blue. But if you look at Dallas, right, pretty much all the leadership is Democrat, right? But you got all these. If you think about it, most of the black community are conservative in their values, but there's no infrastructure. There's no real outreach.
By infrastructure, you mean Republicans don't go out and reach out into these communities.
Correct. And that's been the failure of the Republican Party for the last 50 years. I mean, we go back to the 1964 election with Barry Goldwater, and that when the black church took over. And you follow that with Barry Goldwater not supporting the Civil Rights Bill, and the black church got behind the black community, and that's been it. I mean, the Republican Party didn't need the vote, and the Democrat Party took the vote for granted.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, what happened was you had the minority community that continued to fail. They would make these broad promises. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, and they never deliver. But now, with me being on the other side of it and seeing the fallacy in this understanding, now I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna say, okay, now black community, Hispanic community, minority community, you now have a chance to choose. You have an opportunity.
This is one of the things I really like about Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky.
Yeah.
he goes to places where Republicans oftentimes refuse to go.
That's right.
To give speeches. He welcomes invitations to NAACP and other places where he can go and speak. And I have to speak occasionally. I love going into places where the people they're ideologically different than me, because you get a chance to go and talk to them. If you come in kind of having a little fun, I'm not here to be mean and serious or anything. I'm coming in to tell you here's the difference in opinion and one of the things I think you ought to be considering and so forth. And I think it's great fun. But I just see so many Republicans not even taking a shot at that.
Of course, you know what? Even when I decided to run for Congress in District 30, look, I've had, I'm a staple in the community. This is what I do. I go and I talk to, doesn't matter what political demographic you come from. I try to talk to everybody and bring them into the fold. I say, look, we need change in this district. So I'm the candidate. I'm putting myself in the way of this to come and run. When I decided to do that, Democrat and Republican said, no, don't do it. Don't do it. It's, they're not gonna vote for you. That city has too much crime. That has too much. I mean, just all this gamut of issues of all the reasons that I need to run. They're telling me not to run. So, I made this decision because this is what I wanted to do. Right? I want to give the people of this district, I want to give them a chance. I want to show the party. I want to show all the conservatives across the country. Look, this is how you go in and you deal with people. See, we've completely negated the humanistic factor of all the of politics in this country, right? It's so tribalistic now to where common sense doesn't even prevail in any of these discussions. Mm-hmm. And I was looking at an article today, and it was talking about the coronavirus, mm-hmm. and how that was in January. We knew about it, yep. But Congress did nothing because they were so concerned with impeachment. Yes, that's a problem. That's a problem. So now we're dealing with a national crisis, and we're trying to figure out, okay, who's responsible now? And it's like, look, you completely negated that from, you had January, you had months to work on it, but that's the way our system just simply isn't working for the people right now.
My guest for this hour is Dr. Demetrick Pennie, Dr. Tre Pennie, and we're talking about the conservatives reaching out to the black community and how conservatives can begin to draw some of those blacks into voting for conservatives to reflect, in many cases, their value. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson. Credit goes to Senator Ben Sasse, who has tried to get the U.S. Senate to pass the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Act. This time it was filibustered by 41 Democratic senators. Let me remind you that the bill would merely require doctors to provide medical care to infants who survive an attempted abortion. You might think that this would be standard medical procedure, but you would be wrong. Some who oppose the bill counter that the legislation is unnecessary or that it is redundant. Decades ago, I was speaking at a pro-life event when I met a young woman who survived an abortion attempt. Now in her 40s, she and many other abortion survivors have testified in Congress and in various state legislatures. You might wonder why members of Congress and members of state legislatures oppose legislation to protect a child born alive. It isn't because Americans agree with their opposition. Alexander DeSanctis documents one survey that found that nearly 3/4 of Americans believe doctors should be required to care for infants who survive abortion. I believe that pro-choice politicians who oppose such a bill fear that making even an exception for what is essentially infanticide would weaken their arguments for abortion. And I've also tried to document in previous commentaries that the Democratic Party has become much more extreme on the subject of abortion than they were just a decade ago. Pro-choice politicians also know they don't have to pay any political price for their opposition to this bill because the mainstream media covers for them. Alexander DeSanctis in a recent column provides extensive documentation for how the press inaccurately covered the legislation. That's a sad commentary on both the Congress and the media today in America. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view. From CBN Films, I Am Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland. I Am Patrick in select theaters 2 days only, March 17th and 18th. IamPatrick.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation. And joining me in studio, Dr. Tre Pennie, got his doctorate of education from Texas Tech University not long ago, and a 20-year career with the Dallas Police Force, and he is also running for Congress against Eddie Bernice Johnson. But we're talking right now about the issue of how conservatives reach out to the black community, and can they ever bridge that gap? Dr. Pennie, I know Donald Trump is trying to is making a serious effort to try to do that. You've had Kanye West in the White House supporting President Trump. Kanye West, I understand, has had some things canceled and had some pushback simply because of his support for President Trump. Right. President Trump pardoned an African-American lady who had been in jail for a while. That got some media attention. He has made, and the New York Times just last month, I think, had an article in there saying President Trump is making a concerted effort to reach out to the black community. And I noticed back in November, there were 3 polls that came out, 3 polls, all of which, and these were major polls, Rasmussen being one of them, that had support from the black community for Trump in the 30% range, which sounded a little highish to me. The general understanding among political operatives is if Republicans ever get 20% of the black vote, Democrats are toast. 30% sounded a little high, but maybe it's not. Do you see some support in the black community for President Trump and generally for the way he's taking the country?
I think you got to look at the specific black community that you're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. What I've seen on the ground, because look, I use that all the time in my speeches because I talk about coming from the inner city and being offered a presidential appointment to the White House as recently as 2018. I mean, that was, that's my highest honor. But when I think about that, depending on where I'm at, right? If I'm in a community that's dealing with blight, that narrative doesn't necessarily relate, right? So when you hear President Trump talking about the narrative of President Trump doing well, he's creating jobs and all these things are happening. Some of these communities have not reaped that benefit as of yet, right? So my district is one of these opportunity zones. It's one of the largest opportunity zones in Texas. Yes, it's set up to allow economic development to come into those districts, but it hasn't come yet. So, this is the progress that we're trying to make with the Conservative Party to make sure that we are trying to, bring these resources in. The president has set it up for us. For the black community. So now you have to get in and do something. You got to do it. The criminal justice reform. Oh my God, that's like the greatest. I mean, look, if you have nothing else to hang your hat on with this president, it has to be the criminal justice reform because we've seen how the 1994 crime bill, how it adversely impacted the black community. And it's not like the black community doesn't know because the family members are being that's the reality of it. So we know that there's a problem. What I like to see is the states take it a little bit further because obviously, we're mainly talking about federal prisons, but these adverse policies that negatively impact the black community are still being perpetuated by the state. You have state agendas that are necessarily impacting what the president is doing. Now, you used to be a Democrat, I understand. I grew up in a Democrat household.
What changed?
Well, okay, so the reality is, in most inner city black communities, what we know is the Democrat Party. That's all we grew up around. That's all I grew up around. These progressive policies, these ideas that, I grew up for the longest of time believing that Lincoln was the one that freed the slaves, right? And it wasn't until I got into formal education I really started reading and started understanding, okay, what are my values? How does any of this align with me? That I really understood that the Democrat Party was not the party of the party of abolition or anything that remotely related to what I believed in, and it was the Republican Party. But we saw that the Republican Party just hadn't done a good job of conveying their own narrative, right? Of telling their own story. I always say the Republican Party doesn't have a messaging problem. It has an image problem. You have to get black conservatives. There are black conservatives. I'm a black conservative. You have black conservatives out here that are ready to really brand the party but you have to make sure that you are bringing those conservatives into the communities and you're getting behind them while they're doing things like I'm doing. I'm going to the black community. I'm going to the black church. I'm going to Democrat function because I want people to know that these are human rights issues. These are humanistic issues, right? We've completely obfuscated that value from our politics. We've now it's them or us, and it doesn't really work like that if you really think about it. It's more so how people live. What are the policies that impact the way people live?
Do you get pushback from people in your community? I mean, occasionally I hear stories of people say, well, if you're supporting these conservative policies, it's along the lines of you aren't black enough. I mean, you're just not, you're betraying your party or your people somehow, though. Do you get that kind of pushback?
I've had that. I've had that in the past. And like I said, we're still dealing with an education gap. We're still dealing with a lack of understanding. It's but once I explain my position, I explain, okay, these are the things I'm going to do. Then think about this. I can go anywhere, right? And I just start talking to people. I just explain my policies, the things that I want to do, or the things that are impacting us. Nobody even asks me whether I'm a Democrat or Republican. It's only after the fact that they'll say, wait a minute, you're a conservative? Wait a minute, you're a Republican? Mm-hmm. And that's just how narrow that margin is. You won't know until after, it depends on how extreme a person is on their ideas, right? I'm more of a pragmatic. And I like to talk about real things that impact people's lives. And the black community want to hear those things. But we got to have conservatives that can relate. If you're not relatable, look, there are a lot of people that are gimmicks. I like to call them gimmicks, right? They want to hold up. Yeah, I'm black. I'm over there with them too, and it's not real, right? But when you have somebody who's come from my background, right? Like I said, generational. It's just been being raised in a broken household, being raised by my grandmother, having my grandmother my greatest influence. A lot of the problems, at 16, I witnessed my cousin get killed in front of me the day before wedding day. These are real things that impact people, but you got to look at the things that are happening in the background and how we relate to law enforcement. Law enforcement wasn't a popular thing for our community. That wasn't, we didn't want police in our community, but we were being victimized at a rate higher than any other, than LA at the time. Yes. But these are real things that are impacting the black community. Until you get people in, and I hate to say black leadership, but until you get leadership in office that really understand people and understand what happens in these communities and how policies impact these people, only then will you be able to improve the likelihood of their lives being successful.
The Republican Party oftentimes hands out money to candidates running for Congress around the country. I have heard in times past that if a black Republican would run against a fairly popular black incumbent, a Democrat, that the party just simply wouldn't hand out money there, saying there's no chance that person beating, and it makes it even harder for the person to be able to challenge that incumbent Democrat. Do you hear the same thing? Do you get the same message?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the reality. I mean, I've seen that. Look, I'm going through it right now. But the fact of the matter is, I'm going to run this race for the people, and I'm going to do this for the people. The people that the grassroots, or the people that really believe in me, they have supported me, and they're supporting my grassroots campaign. But it shouldn't have to be that way, right? We're looking at, look, if you don't get the 218 in the U.S. House. Mm-hmm. None of the president's agenda even matters. Yeah. Okay. So the Republican Party right now, they're focusing on these battleground seats. These battleground seats, you can win them or lose them, and it doesn't matter because you're still the minority in the House. So what I've seen this past week, I've seen the Democrat Party. They're saying that they're now investing money. They're going after seats that are heavy Republican, because they want to try to win those seats. Mm-hmm. So they want to improve their majority, and that's the strategy that the Republican Party needs to be taking in an effort to move forward, especially when you have a candidate as such that's running in this type of minority district.
We were talking about crime just a bit ago. You have a 20-year career as a Dallas police officer, and so when we come back from the break, I'd like to find out what made you go into policing. What was it had you make that decision, and what do you see? Because these days there is a real tension between the police and the black community. And it's not entirely clear to some of us what's feeding that tension and exactly what we might be able to do to get it better. So stay with me. When we come back, we're talking with Dr. Tre Pennie. He is running for Congress against Eddie Bernice Johnson, but he also has a 20-year career with the Dallas Police Force. And when we come back, we want to find out more about those tensions between the black community and the police force. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host.
Welcome
for
back.
Point
Merrill
of
Matthews
View.
with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And we have in studio Dr. Tre Pennie, who is running for Congress, but he's also a 20-year veteran of the Dallas Police Force. And that Dr. Pennie, I find that so interesting because you have lived there in the police. Now, tell me, what prompted you to join the police? Was that a lifelong goal for you?
I would say lifelong from the age of 16, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier when I told you my cousin got killed before a wedding day, and but this was an anti-police community, and I just saw all that those fake narratives, those flawed narratives about us not needing the police and all that, and the police were our enemy. That was flawed, because when these guys showed up, and none of them looked like me, these were white officers that showed up, and they were very respectful to my family. But my family was still in that zone where they wouldn't cooperate type thing. So I just saw the fallacy in everything, and I was growing up to believe, and that was the impetus for me to go to the U.S. Army. I didn't have a way out, by the way. We talk all the time about, why didn't you just get up and do it, and just get up and find something. See, this is how it really happens in the black community. There are no options. There are no, I just get up and go to college, or just get up and go get a job. Man, it didn't work that way. It didn't for me. In fact, because we were so anti-government in our beliefs, the military wasn't popular during that part of during that generation, right? It was, we were all anti-whatever. And, but that opened the door for me. That was a catalyst for me to join the military. And I did my 4 years, and I was impacted by the interaction. And it was the worst time of my life, but it was also the most impactful time of my life, because it made me want to become a police officer. I applied with Dallas in 1999, and I got hired, one of the top tier law enforcement agencies in the nation. And, I'm still there right now, till this day, but I love the job. It was a great opportunity to interact with people, and that's how I become an advocate. And I've used everything that I've built over the years to allow me to interact with the community. I tell this story, man. I think it's real, because I think people need to understand. A lot of times there are these failing communities, right? So one day I was on patrol, and I drove through this apartment complex where we have a lot of crime at. And while I'm driving in, this little kid, he's sitting on the curb, and he got his head tucked between his legs. And so I drive up on side of him. I get out the car. I say, "Hey, what's up, little man? You all right?" And he just kind of looked up at me. I said, "Everything okay?" He said, "Yeah, I'm just tired." I said, "Well, what you tired of?" He said, "I'm tired of running." I said, "Well, what you running for?" And he said, "I'm tired of running behind my friends. They got bikes and I don't have one." And I said, "Oh, you don't have a bike?" He said, "No, my mom couldn't afford to buy me one. This the heat of the summer." So I said, "All right, little man, well, stay right here. I'll be right back." So I drove down the road, we used to have an old Toys R Us off of Redbird. And, I'm sorry for Captain Wisdom. And I drove over there, and I went and grabbed the best bike I could grab, man, and threw it in the back of my squad car. And I drove back over there. And I thought the little dude would have been gone. I was just like, God, I hope he's still here. I hope he's still here. And I drove up, and I seen the little guy, and I jumped out, and I gave the bike to him. Man, you should have seen the glow in his face.
Yes.
and what that, that was like, and he got on his bike, and he took off with his friends. And, I was like, man, that's what policing is about. That's what this real humanistic factor is about. And that's the kind of joy I want to bring to this community. That's what I want to do, because it's like, so many people have forgotten this district. So many people have forgotten the people that live here, but they just want to have the same type of life that everyone else has, opportunities. And
I don't know if this is the media perpetuating this notion, or if it's the case, but it seems like that what we hear from the media is that the black community has come to see the police as sort of their worst enemy rather than their best friend.
Right. So that's why, as an advocate for law enforcement, so I push back on that narrative, that this narrative that we don't need the police in our communities, because I went through something that, I went through what I went through as a child. And I saw this coming back as reemergence. And we saw it with the Black Lives Matter movement in 2016.
Right.
and 2015 really. But we started for Ferguson to Baltimore, and it was coming here to Dallas. And I'm like, look, we got a great relationship with our community. We don't need that here. But you had certain people that were perpetuating this idea that they just wanted to do it. And me being an advocate, like I said, I try to prevent it. And unfortunately, we end up losing 5 police officers because of this radicalized agenda. Mm-hmm. And 2 of which were really good friends of mine. And unfortunately, the real issue in itself was you had the radicals that was sowing this negativity into the community. But you got to look at the messaging. You got to look at how they were receiving it. And they were receiving this message through social media. Where does 85% of the American population live? They live right here in social media, right? Mm-hmm. These little mini computers, they control behavior. You want to talk about social engineering? This is social engineering, social media, Facebook, Google, and Twitter. That's why after the shooting attack happened in Dallas, I filed the federal lawsuit against Facebook, Google, and Twitter, because what I wanted to do is expose, and they admitted in open court that they knew their platforms were being used for this radicalized ideology. But what the courts granted them, they granted them immunity protection because of the Communication Decency Act. Basically, what they did is they allowed, they basically said that, look, we know that this type of radicalized agenda, this hate speech, you're calling for attacks and killing police, we know that that's there, but we got protection for allowing it to be there. And that's why, as an advocate, like I said, I know that the courts are reluctant to go in and revise legislative policy, which is why they allowed CDA 230 to keep going forward. Which is why they have not held Facebook, Google, and Twitter accountable for certain behaviors. But I know that in order to fix this, that we have to reform CDA 230, which is basically it's an outdated piece of legislation. It's a part of the 1996 Communication Decency Act. And basically what it says is that online third parties, that the online service providers can't be held liable for what third parties post on the platform. And but basically what that's doing, that's allowing the radicals to misuse that system and basically impact our homeland security interests. So as a law enforcement advocate who's trying to protect police, I'm saying from a law enforcement perspective, we have to have a way to be able to deal with that. We can't even keep up. If you think about how those movements were popping up from Black Lives Matter to Antifa, I mean, some of these radicalized agendas, law enforcement couldn't keep up fast enough because the movements were operating inside of these shadow codes on social media. So you got to have a third party platform that can help help law enforcement keep up with it. With
the rise of gangs out there, I hear occasionally law enforcement saying we're outgunned. They have more guns and they're better guns than what we have. Do you see any kind of disparity between that, or are the police? Do you have the tools that you need, even though the crime is out there?
I think we need more. But what we saw is that under President Obama, he cut back on a lot of the tactical equipment, mm-hmm. and that law enforcement was in drastic need of, and we saw that when President Trump came in, that he reallocated those resources to law enforcement. So we are moving in the right direction, but you got to look, law enforcement. I mean, look, we're governed by, so many different. We got state laws, federal laws, local laws. Law enforcement is trying to stay within these parameters, and still, or still finding themselves on the wrong side. Right? We got use of force guidelines that the NIJ basically created, what basically just say that if a person does this, if a suspect does this, law enforcement, you're justified in using this level of force to meet it, right? And you still have some courts today. We talking about the administration of justice. Some courts are still prosecuting these police that are justified in their actions. And we got to find some balance. We have to find a balance to where we can effectively deal with behaviors that are not conducive to law enforcement. So if you have an officer going out there abusing their power, we want to make sure we'll deal with those behaviors. We deal with those officers. But you have officers that are realistically responding within a split second of an incident occurring, and them responding to that threat. If they are justified in their actions, those officers should be protected. And that's where I think we have to get back to the center on this.
You were with the police department when the killing of the 5 police officers, what was that, 3 years ago now?
Yeah, 2016. This is
4 years
4
ago.
years ago. Yeah.
And so were you engaged in that to some extent? I mean, we're all hands on deck, and so you had to participate?
Yeah, I mean, look, I was called in. I was actually off when it happened, and I was called in. And, look, anytime we have an officer down, officers, they come in from everywhere. I mean, and I was pained, and I got the phone call. I dropped everything, and I, grabbed my weapon and everything, and I ran in. So by the time I got close to downtown, they said, look, you need to head to Parkland Hospital. And when I got there, it was like a war zone. It was something you never seen before.
When we come back from the break, I'd like to get you to address a question, Michael Brown in Ferguson. We'll be back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. Merrill Matthews, and in studio with me, Dr. Tre Pennie, and we're talking about his campaign for to replace Eddie Bernice Johnson and his career on the Dallas Police Force. If you want to find out more about him, we've got a bio on the Point of View website. You can go there, and you can also click through. I think there's a link to his website there, so you can go and check that out and find out more information about him. So, Dr. Pennie, Michael Brown and the Ferguson situation. It was a traumatic thing for the country. But as time progressed and we found out more of the facts, we found out Michael Brown was not a sterling person. He had apparently robbed some things from a convenience store right before the interaction with the police officer. The hands up, don't shoot thing became a national cry, and the report from this came out and said, well, apparently that wasn't the case. When the autopsy and other things, he did not have his hands up. That seems to have been a false narrative. And so as you move away from this, there are some of us who look at this and say, I understand there have been times when the police officers and have not done right by blacks and the black community. Understand that. Perfect. I mean, you can highlight those, but this doesn't seem to be one of those as much as I can tell. And yet he remains to be something of an icon. I still hear occasionally hands up, don't shoot, and some other things, and referring back to him as if he were the wronged person. And it's not entirely clear. And I just don't understand this. Why would you make him an idol when there's others clearly who've had encounters with law enforcement where the law enforcement did not act properly that you might use as highlight? Why Michael Brown?
Well, you got to look. We got to look at the parity in the two different relationships, right? And those of you that have not read the Ferguson report, the DOJ's Ferguson report,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important for you to go look at it. I mean, just to get an idea of the problems that were happening there in Ferguson. So this was more of an opportunistic, radicalized agenda than anything else, because it was like the perfect storm for what was happening in Ferguson at the time.
Mm-hmm.
With their relationship between law enforcement and the community, and then the situation happened with Michael Brown. Michael Brown, who was, by the way, in violation of the law when he committed the robbery just this time before, but he assaulted the officer just before being shot. And people, they want to forget the facts on what actually happened with that case. But you got to remember, there are certain people that were carrying this narrative. There's certain, so-called, community leaders that are from the black community that were carrying this narrative because they wanted to create that divide. It helped them further their agenda. And we talked about the whole Black Lives Matter deal at the time. They needed hands up, don't shoot to help further their agenda in pushing the divide between police and the community. Which is something that put me right in the middle of it, because I knew better, and to be honest with you, a lot of people, I've talked to people from St. Louis that, that were actually, they know. I mean, they know. And it's not like, they were tricking anybody, but I'm going to tell you something. When you have statesmen coming out and they're portraying that narrative as well, they're not going to come out and back up and take steps back. Like, you know what, I was wrong when I said that. They're not going to do it. And until this day, they haven't done that.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to remember that, the political leaders that got involved in that, they helped sow it. The media really helped push it. I mean, that was, we basically lost control of it because of the media. And then social media, what was happening in the undergirds of this whole, of the whole process. That really made the problem worse for law enforcement, because law enforcement had to work its way back to improve its relationship with the community. Even though you had law enforcement agencies across the country that had nothing, their relationship with their police was, the communities were nothing like Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was an anomaly. That's over there. That was happening in that community, but that wasn't indicative of the whole law enforcement profession at the time.
Yeah.
And I think law enforcement got a bad rap, and in fact, it opened the door for radicalized attacks on police that I think everyone really should be talking about now, because in fact, I'm one of these people that, if you look at what the these hate crimes, right, and why individuals are attacked specifically because of their race, color, sex, creed. There's also a caveat in the hate crime policy that says or other identifier where a person is attacked because of that. I like to see law enforcement added to that category, because you had law enforcement officers being attacked simply because they wore the uniform, hadn't done anything. They were being, we have to make sure that we're doing more in this country to protect our law enforcement. It's a difficult job. Not very many people can do it, but the ones that get out here and they sacrifice their lives, man, we got to make sure we're protecting these guys.
Now, we had been talking about conservatives, and you have 5 pillars of what it is to be a conservative. I mean, what the foundations of a conservative. What are those 5 pillars?
Yeah, and just in context, and with us talking about that, there's so many people that are Republicans that are saying that they're conservatives, but they have no idea what's including conservatism. So my pillars, and I like to keep it simple for most people, is
it's always a good idea.
There you go. Personal responsibility. Number 1, personal responsibility. People are responsible for their own actions, right? Mm-hmm. Fiscal responsibility. We got to control spending. We have to control spending. We can't lay the debt that this country raised on the back of our kids, right? Limited government. Get the government out of our lives. Stop having government. Cannot. As long as the government has control, they're going to continue to keep thumbs on us. They're going to continue to keep their thumb on us. That's what kept us in the ghettos for years. And we got to make sure we remember that. National sovereignty. Every government, every country has their borders. Every country should be able to operate as an independent entity. And the rule of law. And we cannot forget the rule of law. That's what made the United States what it is today. Is the rule of law. We are governed by our laws. Our laws help keep us safe. Our laws help protect us. We have to make sure that those 5 pillars are they continue to go on in perpetuity.
I think Republicans would agree with you on all of those. The one thing where they seem to really be fading on is the fiscal responsibility.
Well, you know what? Well, and I want to go back. I want to address that just a little bit. Only because all the cuts that the Obama administration made, especially in the areas of Department of Defense, the military, we all those cuts made us unsafe, and I can understand why President Trump, did a reversal on that, which pushed up spending because, we were weak, and we were weak in terms of not being at a strong position. To be able to respond to threats, right? Especially when you look at the proliferation of weapons with Russia, China, and what they're doing, all these different escalations, the United States need to be prepared to respond. So that was, if I'm going to give a pass to anything, it's going to be a pass on DOD.
I understand the pass on DOD, though they end up spending a lot on other things. And at least with Republicans, my sense is on fiscal issues, the difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Republicans at least claim to feel bad about spending so much money. But President Trump is going to have to try to get some of this spending under control. But even now, with the coronavirus out there, one of President Obama's former economic chairman is coming out proposing $350 billion in new spending. Well, Dr. Pennie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing everything with us. If you're interested in finding out more about Dr. Pennie, we have his bio on the website, pointofview.net. You can go there. There will be information and a link to contact him and find out more about him. So, Dr. Pennie, thank you. Best of luck, and surely appreciate your service with the police department.
That's right. Absolutely. Thank you for having me. PennieForCongress.com. Thank you.
Good. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about fringe presidential candidates, a new book out. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And in this hour, we're going to be talking about presidential fringe candidates. In our next hour, we'll be going to Dan Pilla to talk about tax time. The tax man cometh, and so we're not far off from April 15th, so we'll want to go back and touch on that, let you find out some things, let you ask him questions if you have some about the tax issues. But for this hour, I am really excited about this. Our guest this hour is Mark Stein. He is the author of The Presidential Fringe, Questing and Jesting for the Oval Office. There's a picture of it right there. He's also the author of the book How the States Got Their Shapes. That turned out to be a History Channel series. It was very interesting and very popular, and he's authored a number of other books as well. And his wife is a reference specialist at the Library of Congress. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. Thank you for the plug for my wife. Very exciting.
We always have to plug our wives.
Yes.
This was a fascinating book. I looked at this and I thought, I don't remember seeing anything out there quite like this before, but it's fascinating because those of us who have been around a little while have seen a number of these fringe candidates, and maybe in some cases you might call them third-party candidates. In other cases, they're fringe candidates. But you touch on a number of people that I'm familiar with Joseph Smith and some of his history. I did not know that Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, ran for president back in 1844. I keep getting my dates mixed up. But let's start out by talking about what is the distinction between a fringe candidate and a third-party candidate, because you have third parties out there. You have the Green Party, you have the Libertarian Party. They tend to put forward relatively respectable candidates running for their offices. I wouldn't call them fringe, but in some cases, somebody might call one of these parties a fringe. What's the difference between a fringe party and a third party?
Well, I'll tell you the whole notion of categories. It's unfortunate about the title in that respect, because categories are fixed entities, and very little in the human perception is fixed, if you will. So in some of these chapters, as you noted, I'll say, well, you might consider this person third party and not fringe. Actually, and by the way, there are a number of candidates who one could call fringe that are not in the book. Here's what the book used as to decide who's in, who's out, if you will, was humor, laughter. That if you received an overwhelming amount of laughter for running, ridicule, or if you ran for laughs, such as Pat Paulson or Gracie Allen in 1940, those are the ones that I wanted to look at. And of course, that would put them on the fringe, vibrating for laughs or laughed at. And the reason for laughter, as opposed to, say, some fringe candidate who was a hate group or something out there on the fringe, is that laughter contains a seed of something serious. And because of that, they really provided, I found, a very interesting lens on voices or notions that were not really being heard at that point in time in this country, and so it was a kind of really unusual lens into aspects of history that we might otherwise sort of miss amid the larger picture.
Now, you list a number of people. You have most of the chapters are really quite short, but it allows you to cover a number of people and issues. But I was fascinated that Joseph Smith apparently ran for president in 1844. The Mormons were having to kept moving west because of problems that they were having at the time. How did that candidacy come about?
Well, that was a really interesting candidacy, I think. Of course, yes, the Mormons were terribly persecuted, treated as a cult when they started. But when they started really attracting followers, they were real quickly. They were violently chased out of Missouri. They then migrated to Nauvoo, Illinois, and ultimately were by 1844 when he ran, facing the same kind of violence and threats of massacre, which eventually materialized, and that's when after Joseph Smith went to Salt Lake City, a great number of them. So Joseph Smith's candidacy was, I think, and of course both in Missouri and in Illinois, he appealed to the governor for protection and didn't get it. So I think his candidacy was really to raise awareness of religious freedom in this country. Mm-hmm. And although what's also interesting is he had a platform. He put out a platform. And while religious freedom was in it, it actually also had economic issues, all the issues of the day, if you will. Mm-hmm. He gave his views on. And what fascinated me in the press, they'd make fun of him, but then they'd say, very often when they say things, they call him General Joe, because he was the Mormons had to form their own militia. So they sort of mocked him with General Joe, where they wouldn't have called either the mainstream candidates by their first name back then in that way. And they say things like, I got to say, General Joe's positions really are kind of the best ones on economics, on slavery. He had a position on anti-slavery, but how to try to get out of this without a war. So in that respect, boy, it really amplified that there was much more to the Mormons, than just this one, just their religious devotion. I mean, they thought about economics. They were concerned about economics. They were concerned about slavery. They were concerned about everything that everybody else was, and had views on that. I don't think they were monolithic views. These were Joseph Smith's views. What ended his candidacy, sadly, is assassination, which was during his campaign. Had he not been assassinated, by the way, his plan was to hold a convention in Baltimore following that of the two major parties. And there was such a scrum among the major parties, much like we were seeing at least a while back with the Democrats. He might have actually been able to be a kingmaker, not a president, I don't think. But he might have been able to kind of throw support. And by throwing support, hopefully get some protection for his people.
Interesting.
That was cut short when he was killed. Yeah, unfortunate story. Yeah.
My guest is Mark Stein. He is the author of The Presidential Fringe: Questing and Jesting for the Oval Office, and he covers a number of candidates. And when we come back from a break, Mark, let's talk about the first woman candidate. Hillary Clinton was the first one to gain a major nomination, but she wasn't the first female candidate. And then there was also the first black candidate from 1904. And as you point out, a number of the candidates were a bit on the humor side. They were comedians in some ways, and it created some interesting times. So stay with us. We'll be back with Mark Stein in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
In this highly politicized culture, we see that more and more people are called racist. Dennis Prager has been watching this and even seen the label used against him. His commentary not only tells his story, but provides some insight on why the left calls good people racist. After he spoke at a Turning Point event, the vice provost for diversity at Purdue University claimed that Prager said slavery was not bad. Dennis Prager explains that he never said anything remotely like that. After he mentioned it on his radio show, the provost wrote to Prager and suggested they meet, but offered no apology. Prager provides another example from his radio program where he mentioned some of the offensive words used by President Truman. A listener called to ask why Prager would repeat one offensive word but not use the N-word. He merely replied that the left has rendered the N-word the only unutterable word in the English language. Days later, news stories surface claiming that Prager said it's idiotic that you can't say the N-word. Prager believes that there are two major reasons why the left smears with the label racist. First, truth is not a left-wing value. Truth, he explains, is a liberal value and truth is a conservative value, but truth is not a value of the left. As we've discussed in previous commentaries, he makes a clear distinction between liberalism and the left. Second, smearing opponents is not only a left-wing value, it's a standard operating procedure. The left does not win through argument, it wins through smear. Making a well-reasoned argument in the public sphere, and you will be smeared with the label racist, sexist, bigoted, intolerant, homophobic, Islamophobic, or xenophobic. It's easier to call someone a racist or a fascist than to make a reasoned argument. That's why the left does it. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From CBN Films, I Am Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland. I Am Patrick, in select theaters 2 days only, March 17th and 18th. IamPatrick.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and with me on the phone, Mark Stein, author of the new book, The Presidential Fringe, Questing and Jesting for the Oval Office. Mark, you start your chapter on Victoria Woodhull by saying, this is your first sentence, because she was female, presidential candidate Victoria Woodhull could not vote for herself in the 1872 election. That's an amazing statement, but it's absolutely true. What encouraged her to jump into the campaign in 1872?
Well, I think it was to raise awareness that a woman could be a intelligent, reasonable candidate for office and was as able as a man to participate in politics. I think that was probably what caused her to take that additional step and say, and therefore I'm not going to run for president. It was the middle of the suffrage movement, so she certainly was not alone in making that argument. Mm-hmm. But she was alone in many ways in running for president. Quick anecdote on that. One of the leading figures in the suffrage movement was Susan B. Anthony.
Right.
She did cast the ballot for president in New York and was promptly arrested for doing so because it was not allowed. But here's what's interesting to me about it. She didn't vote for Victoria Woodhull. She voted for Ulysses S. Grant. So once again, that lens that I speak of kind of helps us see with perhaps greater clarity that even back in those matriarchs of the feminist movement were not monolithic in their thinking. She didn't agree with Victoria Woodhull's choice to run for president. And I think what's refreshing periodically in this book is that it reminds us that people who today are sort of these heroic images to us, they really were not all in agreement, or and people are different. People are different.
Well, you write in there, the shattering of political parties in the aftershocks of the Civil War reveals why 1872 was the year the first woman ran for president. So the after the war, you had some struggles among the parties because you had the Democrats coming back in. It was primarily controlled by Republicans in Congress, but there were new alignments that were forming, and that sort of at least opened the door for her to step in. But it's an interesting campaign. I don't think I saw a campaign slogan in there, but it would be along the lines of "Vote for me," even though I can't vote for myself.
Yes, yeah, and she enjoyed a great amount of ridicule. Of course, some of it, to my mind, I'm not going to detail it on the air because I don't know if it's appropriate. Some of it, to my mind, was close to obscene. I mean, papers weren't. Yeah, she was a fascinating woman. Of course, we could spend an hour talking about Victoria Woodhull, but she and her sister were the first women to have seats on the New York Stock Exchange. This was a little earlier in her life. And then they published a newspaper together and ran into issues with the New York Society for Suppression of Vice when they revealed an affair with two people in New York's upper crust. And,
yes.
Just a fascinating woman, and one piece of it was, and she ran for president. Yeah.
Now, Barack Obama was the first black president, but George Edwin Taylor was the first black presidential candidate back in 1904.
Right. A lot of people think Shirley Chisholm because she got a lot of visibility when she ran for president. But it was really George Edwin Taylor in 1904. And his candidacy was, again, intriguing to me because I would have, when I went to research that chapter, I thought, oh boy, get ready for ridicule. This one, you're going to have to be careful what you print. And in fact, it was very hard to find the ridicule in print. I'm sure all kinds of things,
yes.
Yes, all kinds of things were said between people, I would guess. But in print, it was not acceptable, apparently, in 1904 to make overtly racist or, degrading remarks about someone based on their race. So there was surprisingly little ridicule. So that, to me, was part of the lens that he provided. He, like Victoria Woodhull, and like Joseph Smith, by the way, he had a platform. He spoke to all the issues. He didn't just speak to issues of race. The other thing that fascinated me, that the sharpest criticism he got, not ridicule now, we're just talking about criticism, came from African-American newspapers. And again, as with Victoria Woodhull, not all African-Americans at the turn of the century, just as today, think alike, and yet another reminder that people are not, groups are not monolithic. So he faced some pushback for stepping into that role when people thought that's not the way to go now. Others, of course, were supportive of him.
One of the very interesting things I think you do is you go through and you identify the statements from papers around the country. And of course, in the 1800s, papers were sort of the source of communication for an awful lot of people. And even in smaller towns, the newspaper, the daily newspaper, carried a significant weight. So you identify even Marshalltown and a number, in Iowa, a number of what are generally considered smaller towns today. But you highlight some of the statements they said, and then in many cases, it seemed in many cases they actually took some of the platforms and dealt with those and dealt with them seriously as newspapers, even if they weren't necessarily going to support the candidate. But it sort of highlights the roles that newspapers played back then in discussing major issues.
Yes, yeah, they were the form of mass communication back in that day, and then as in the book one sees, technology just really changed the game, not only on fringe candidates, that's kind of the least of it, but in how we get our news and see the world.
Now, one of the things I really liked about it was that you highlight some of the candidates who were having a little bit of fun with this. So Mark Twain was one, Will Rogers, Gracie Allen, and Pat Paulson. So start out with Mark Twain, because that's a name that so many of us are familiar with, and you've got a short chapter in there on him.
Right. In a certain way, I wouldn't have included Mark Twain because he really didn't campaign for president. He wrote a newspaper piece that was published in newspapers all across the country, in which he kind of did a mock announcement for president, and it was beginning to become a tradition to accuse your opponent of various scandalous things in their past. Actually, I think that goes back to Jefferson and Adams. But and so he said, "Well, I'm not going to be vulnerable to that. I'm going to tell you all the things that didn't." And so he made up these things. It was very funny, but it was a one-off campaign. It was just that. Beyond that, he didn't really, continue with it. And this was a man who was on the stage and would give talks. He certainly could have continued in the way that Will Rogers did. But I included him because he was the first humorist to even take a swing at it.
Mm-hmm.
So his was really, if you will, a joke, if you will, kind of more like a joke than a campaign. He made his joke and he was done. And I think there were reasons, and probably wise ones on his part, not to pursue that joke into a campaign.
Will Rogers was a little different, though. I mean, Will Rogers, there were people who he was a humorist, but people were taking that somewhat seriously with him.
Some people did. And Will Rogers ran on what he called the anti-bunk party.
We could use a little of that these days.
Well, and the second earliest candidate I covered was John Donkey in 1848.
Yes.
If I can just jump back to him for a second. He's a cartoon candidate from a satirical magazine, and he would use this kind of eloquence, and it was all a bunch of hot air, but we didn't have the word hot air yet. But I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. After the revolution, what would be political language in this country? What kind of oratory, what kind of rhetoric would one use to get elected? By 1848, pretty clearly there had been a style that had evolved and the public didn't care for it. And so he mocked it. John Donkey mocked it. But again, we didn't have a word for it then. The word hot air didn't exist. But if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, which gives the origins of words from the English language and phrases, and you look up hot air, it originated in the United States, and it originated in 1874. And just to bring this back to where we began this section, the person who first recorded use, Mark Twain.
Oh, boy. All right, stay with us. We'll be back with Mark Stein in just a minute.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And on the phone with me is Mark Stein, author of The Presidential Fringe, Questing and Jesting for the Oval Office. And we're talking about that book and some of the fringe candidates out there. You know, Mark, there was a movie about Will Rogers, a sort of a biopic from, I think, probably the 40s or early 50s or so. And Will Rogers would go out there and do his little rope tricks, and he would begin talking. And I remember in one of those sections there, because he says he's moving his rope around a little bit. He says, "I'm not a member of any organized political party.
Yeah.
I'm a Democrat."
Right.
and of course, I think he may have been in New York at the time, and at that time, New York would have been mostly Republican, or largely Republican, I think. And it gets a huge roar of laughs. But he begins dipping his toe in this, and that begins people love what he's doing and making fun of the political process in some sense, and yet bringing some light to the political process.
Right. You know, I live in Washington, D.C., and I remember, I don't even know where I saw it, quote from him where he says that, you know, he tells a lot of jokes, but he never tells a joke in Washington, D.C., because if he tells a joke in Washington, D.C., Congress will make it a law. His humor just lives on. It just lives on. I don't know if that's fortunate or not, but yeah, absolutely. Although he was, you know, well, starting back in vaudeville and then into film and then radio. Interestingly enough, his comic campaign for president in 1928 was in the pages of Life magazine. Mm-hmm. A little bit spilled over into some other media, but primarily it was waged in the magazine. As we mentioned before, the anti-bunk party, and I have a quote here from one of the ones, which is my favorite, I think, from his campaign, where he says, "Of all the bunk handed out during a campaign, the biggest one of all is to try and compliment the knowledge of the voter and tell him he can't be fooled like he used to be." It's just, and you know, we're hearing it again, and we'll probably continue to hear it because it's just a good, solid selling point, I guess, for a candidate.
Now, you have a chapter on Gracie Allen, and some of our listeners are going to, are at least probably old enough to catch the tail end of her career with George Burns. Right. And of course, Gracie Allen comes across as something of kind of a dingy person on the show. George is sort of the standard, the reasonable one who's having to deal with his wife, Gracie. But you make the case she's a very smart woman, knows exactly what she's doing.
Oh, well, of course, and which is, I don't think you can be a comedian and not be very smart in what you're doing.
Good point.
Comedy comes down to a split second. You got to absolutely be aware of what you're up to. So Lucille Ball, you know, any given comedian, but particularly what's fascinating with the women comedian, looking at starting, let's say, with this era of Gracie Allen, and there's been a lot of scholarship on this, by the way, is that how much of their humor is rooted in self-deprecatory humor. Lucille Ball was very much a master at self-deprecating humor, despite, you know, tremendous intelligence and business savvy, and Gracie Allen the same, with a kind of a daffiness, and George would, you know, or others would feed her lines, and she'd just come back with these wonderfully daffy things. And when they came up with his idea, really a publicity stunt, where she would run for president in 1940, she was resistant to it because she'd never done a solo act. She always, you know, worked with mainly George, but someone, if it was the radio show or later the TV show, who would feed her the setups, and then she'd come out with the daffy line. Mm-hmm. She didn't know how she's going to do as a single stand-up comedian. Of course, she had writers, and writers were very good at it. She's so interesting to me because it really, again, that lens of a pivotal time for women, and you can see it in her campaign. And I'll try to do this again as quickly as I can. First of all, there was the question, what do we do with George? while she's on the platform of the train giving a speech. They would have little parades. It was a railroad campaign that went from California to Omaha. And in one parade, George rode a little ox cart. In another parade, he rode a little mini racing car. So George basically kind of supported what she was doing by clowning around as a disempowered husband. And then if you turn to what Gracie was saying, for the most part, she was doing her Gracie thing, which was the self-effacing humor. I have a line here. She would often begin by saying, I know you must be as excited as I am to find out what I stand for.
Yes, you've got that in the book.
Yeah, it's got a great Gracie line. But then she, particularly as it went on, she would not entirely, but she'd start to throw in lines that were a little different. I'm trying to find this one real quick. Well, I'll go from memory on it. I may have a little off, but it was something like, a platform is something a politician stands on and the voters fall for. It's like a Will Rogers line.
Yes.
Poking fun at the voters and at the politicians, not so much at herself. And then one other I want to mention, again, I'm just going to go from memory, so I may have to quote a little off. At one point, she started to throw in lines. She said, by the way, wouldn't Mrs. Roosevelt make a great president? She's so intelligent, and she's this, she said. And then she said, but wait a minute, who am I campaigning for, her or me? So there's this, she used the humor, but she was sort of turning it, and in terms of empowerment, her ability to make an assertion rather than put the pie in her own face. Very, very interesting. And just to cast a very quick glance down, you don't even have to detail it, a later comedian who ran for president was Roseanne Barr. Well, that was Roseanne Barr, a very complicated individual. But boy, she is not a daffy comedian. She's a very self-empowered performance that she gives. Her comedy works on her authority. And by the way, just I should mention, none of this is monolithic either, because all the way back in the days, of Gracie Allen, you also had Mae West.
Yes.
Who was a very empowered comedian. Her career paid a bit of a price for it with censorship and things like that, but not all women comedians were self-effacing. Yeah.
You also mentioned Pat Paulson, who I suspect a number of our listeners will recall, and he was on the Smothers Brothers show and carried that on for 2 or 3. I mean, it wasn't just one campaign. He entered the presidential race like 3 times, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, he did. He tried to keep the act going, not ever as successfully as when it was on the Smothers Brothers show, and there it kind of it really gets into that heyday of the networks right before cable television becomes into existence. The power of these networks, again, I'll try to be real brief, but they brought on the Smothers Brothers and probably encouraged them. This is on CBS to be edgy, I'll say, because they were trying to put a dent in Bonanza over on NBC. Honestly, this was, and so when they did the Pat Paulson thing, they did other things too in this vein on the Smothers Brothers. It was part of this trying to dent Bonanza. So one of Pat Paulson's speeches on the show had to do with censorship, because the Smothers Brothers had just been censored over another issue, and so they were going to build this kind of battle with their own network. And we wove it into Pat Paulson's things, too. And at a certain point, I actually kind of tipped on them, where CBS said, you know what, this is too much, and guess what, you're canceled. But it really gets into the weeds of network power and the power of the 3 big networks at that point in our history. And, of course, that is 1968. When there were a huge number of fringe candidates and tremendous turmoil in the country. So Paulson was also, a piece of that too, sort of a network piece of that.
My guest this hour has been Mark Stein. His book, The Presidential Fringe, Questing and Jesting for the Oval Office. We have more information about that on our website, pointofview.net, so you can go there and find out more about Mark. Mark, any other new books in the works you would be interested in?
Risky to say, but I'll go out on a limb here. We are working at W.W. Norton on a young reader's version of How the States Got Their Shapes.
Oh, good,
I think it's going to happen, and I'm actually quite excited about it because in condensing all that down, all the details down, there's a really interesting sort of narrative that got lost in the details of the first one because there's so many state lines. So looking for that.
Thank you for joining us, Mark Stein. We'll be back in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to this closing segment of this hour. We had on our last, for the last three-quarters of an hour, Mark Stein and his book, The Presidential Fringe, where he's talking about fringe candidates out there. In our next hour, we'll have Dan Pilla back. Dan is the tax analyst extraordinaire, has a relationship going back with Point of View, I guess, nearly 30 years now. He's been around as long as I can recall. And Dan just is going to talk a little bit about some of the presidential candidates and their tax reform proposals out there. Joe Biden just came out with his recent one, what he wants to do with income tax and how he wants to raise taxes. We know that Bernie Sanders wants to raise taxes significantly, especially on higher income individuals and corporations. And Donald Trump is, I think, looking for ways to actually cut taxes again, as he did in the 2017 tax reform legislation. So we'll have Dan Pilla there, and he'll be taking your calls as well. Right now, we're going to talk just a little bit about Bernie Sanders and his it was interesting that prior to the Super Tuesday election, it seemed like the media had nominated Bernie Sanders as the Democratic presidential candidate, and Joe Biden was yesterday's news. And after that election, now the media seem to have nominated Joe Biden, and Bernie Sanders is yesterday's news. It's interesting how quick things can change, though. With Elizabeth Warren dropping out of the presidency, it's not clear that all the votes that she got, the pledges that she got, would necessarily go to Bernie Sanders, even though Bernie Sanders is closest to her in their sort of platforms. But if you took her 25 presidential pledges, her candidate pledges, and added that to Bernie Sanders' total, he was only about 2 or 3 votes different than Joe Biden. So we'll have to see where this goes. We've got more votes coming up on Tuesday, tomorrow, and so it will be, and then the next week. So it's that should give us some clarity, but we may not have anybody with a majority. So we may actually be coasting on to the Democratic convention to see if we have a winner. I think Kirby's actually on record now as saying he thinks there's a pretty fair chance it could end up having to be a brokered convention because there may not be anyone with enough votes. But what has been fascinating me is how much the focus on Bernie Sanders and his embrace of socialism is an attempt to try to reject the authoritarian views of so many socialists out there and communists. And yet, here just recently, he was back in defending Fidel Castro and some of the things that he wanted to do. He mentioned that Fidel Castro came in and he said, I don't appreciate his authoritarian approach, but he had a literacy campaign and vastly expanded literacy in Cuba, which got me thinking, are there other communist leaders that Bernie Sanders might find some positive points about? And so I wrote a piece for The Hill. It's available at thehill.com. And it talks about Bernie Sanders could find some positive points about Joseph Stalin, the head of the Soviet Union for so many years. Take the literacy campaign. Once Lenin and then Stalin solidified their control, when Stalin took power, he made literacy and the expansion of schools a major issue. But one of the groups that monitored this, as I point out in there, this wasn't about just helping people read. Stalin actually oversaw the creation of textbooks and what they were saying, because he didn't just want people to read. He wanted people to read Marxist works and pro-Soviet propaganda. There was an ulterior motive behind what Joseph Stalin was doing when he expanded literacy. So it wasn't just for the good of people. It was for that. Joseph Stalin also created free health care, what you might call Medicare for all. They established a free health care system so that anyone could go and get health care anytime they needed it. But as it turns out, it was a terrible system, and the CIA, of all places, in 1999 released a report looking at the healthcare system in Russia, and pointed out not that long after going up even through those years, and just said it is a terrible system in which the facilities are second rate. You can't get access to care. Lines are waiting, the long waiting lines and so forth. It is a terrible healthcare system, and as a result, life expectancy in the Soviet Union in the 50s was significantly less than it was in any developed country. The USA was in the In the Soviet Union, it was in the high 50s, low 60s as age-wise. In the U.S., it was already getting into the 70s, and it stayed that way now till just recently, the last 10 years or so. The Soviet Union, the life expectancy was significantly lower those of every other developed economy. Part of that had to do with the healthcare system. And then, of course, I talk a little bit about income inequality because that is a big issue for Bernie Sanders. The old statement is that capitalism is the unequal distribution of wealth. Socialism is the equal distribution of poverty. And you see that in the Soviet Union also. The interesting thing is, even though in communist countries most people tend to be poor, the leaders of the country tend to be quite wealthy. And Forbes magazine used to actually track this and would go and talk about the richest leaders of countries in the world, and they would put Fidel Castro at 7th in the world, the 7th richest leader in the world. The last time they checked this, I think it was about 2005, 2006, they had Fidel Castro at $900 million in wealth. Now, Fidel Castro said, I don't have any wealth. I'm here for the people. But in fact, he controlled the country and controlled all the assets. And they put it at about $900 million for his wealth. And of course, in today's terms, that would actually make him a billionaire. And that might actually be the only billionaire that Bernie Sanders has not criticized. So it's interesting to see what happens here. And Stalin himself, in 2015, Real Clear Politics went and took a look at this and tried to estimate Stalin's assets by virtue of his control of the country, put it at well over $1 trillion for Stalin. So there is wealth in those countries. It just doesn't happen to get to individuals. But if you want to know more about social democrats and their positions, you can go to the Social Democrats of America website. It's available, easy to find. They have a Resistance Rising website, a paper out there, Socialist Strategy in the Age of Political Revolution. This seems to be a fairly new, and it wasn't there not too long ago, but they highlight the things that they feel like are there and are key elements for them. In fact, it says June 2016, but they highlight their campaign issues, how they want to achieve socialism for everyone, and why they think they are somehow the other better than all the other socialist countries that we are familiar with, because in all the major socialist countries, they decline into totalitarianism. People lose access to wealth, they lose access to jobs, they have to go by they lose access to freedom of the press, they lose access to almost all the freedoms that we consider important here, and yet our younger people in the country seem to be embracing this as something new and a new untried way that they can try to create some kind of fairness or equality or something of that nature. So you might go to the Democratic Socialists of America, log on to their website, and you will be able to find out more about their agenda and maybe give you an insight into Bernie Sanders. When we come back, Dan Pilla will be here to talk about taxes. The tax man's coming in about a month, so we want to stay tuned, and he'll be able to take your questions if you have any. Stay with us, and we'll be back in a minute.
From CBN Films comes I Am Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, taken from his home into slavery, then a miraculous escape, only to be called back.
It was not my grace, but God, that I might come to the Irish nations to preach the gospel.
A journey from man to saint. I Am Patrick. In select theaters for 2 days only, March 17th and 18th. Theater and ticket information is available at IamPatrick.com.
Truth has a price tag, but lies cost even more. The damage done when people don't tell the truth is beyond measure. Many today value power more than truth, but you are not like that. You know that truth is what sets us free. Help Point of View Radio be an oasis of truth in a desert of lies. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Get all the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Make an investment in a great future. Make an investment in truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to our final hour. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And on the phone with us this hour is Dan Pilla, taxman extraordinaire. Dan's relationship with Point of View goes back, I think, at least 30 years, as long as I've ever been around here, and I've been tied to the organization like 28 years or so, off and on. And Dan was, Marlon Maddox used to have Dan on decades ago, let's say, to talk about tax issues. And, of course, we're 5 weeks out from April 15, and Dan is one of the country's leading experts on this. He's been on every major television show. He's been in newspapers. He is cited often. He has published books on this, and he writes often. He's got his own blog that he writes about this on his website. So I'm going to encourage you to go to pointofview.net. We have a bio up there, and you can read through all of the things that Dan has done and accomplished. And you can also find information to reach out to him and contact him. Dan, thank you for joining us again.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Merrill. Thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you again, friend.
Oh, we're longtime friends. And Dan, you know, it's we've got the tax man coming is always a bit of a strain for some of us, but now we've got the market in gyrations and don't know what's going to happen. And, you know, with respect to the presidential campaign here, just right before Super Tuesday, the media had sort of written off Joe Biden and had nominated Bernie Sanders as the next Democratic presidential candidate. After Super Tuesday, they reversed that, and now they've written off Bernie Sanders, and they seem to be nominating Joe Biden. But Joe Biden just released his tax plan. I don't think I had seen it, but I just saw it come out here. Bernie Sanders has had his tax plan for somewhat just raise taxes on everybody making an income, wealth tax, and so forth. But let's start out by talking a little bit about what their tax plans would be, because that could end up affecting us. We don't know right now. You know, historically, if you're an incumbent president running for re-election, in a good economy, you win re-election. Just regardless of who you are, if the economy is good and you're running for re-election, you win. The economy has been good. It certainly might be good by the election time, but we just don't know what's going to happen with the country, with the stock market gyrations, and the coronavirus could end up dragging the president down and the U.S. economy down through no fault of the president's own. This is something China imposed on us. But we don't. It sort of makes it incumbent that we look at some of the other candidates' plans too. So what do you think about Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders' tax plans?
Well, let's just talk generally here, Merrill, to start with, because obviously there's a lot of details of it. Bernie's plan has been out there for years, frankly, and Biden's plan has just been coming out in dribs and drabs here over the last 4 weeks or 6 weeks or so. But the crowning jewel, if you will, if I can call it that, maybe it's not a crowning jewel, maybe it's the coronavirus of tax policy. That's probably what it is. Of both of these plans is the wealth tax. Mm-hmm. And really what each of these individuals, and not just that Warren was proposing this and Klobuchar was proposing this, all of the Democrat candidates were falling all over themselves to propose plans to steal money from individuals that earned it lawfully and peacefully, and that's really what it amounts to. The way I've categorized this wealth tax Merrill, and see if you agree with this. Is it's really a death tax, but the Democrats don't have the patience to wait for the guy to die before they steal his money. That's really what it amounts to. Bernie Sanders has made it perfectly clear that he hates rich people, even though he himself is a rich guy, I guess. It's astonishing to me, but he's made the claim that there shouldn't be any billionaires, and so what he is very specifically proposing is a tax that's not so much intended to raise revenue, although certainly they get money out of it. It's intended to destroy the capital that's held in the hands of certain classes of people that, again, have earned it peacefully and lawfully. Now, Merrill, it's one thing to freeze the assets of a person or confiscate the assets of a person who's committed a crime. We would expect that to happen, and we would expect those assets to be returned to the victim of the crime, right? Mm-hmm. If somebody robs a bank, the money's got to go back to the bank. If somebody breaks into your house and steals all your jewelry, you should get your jewelry back when they catch the crook. But what we're talking about here is the theft of property from people who have earned it lawfully and peacefully. They haven't broken any laws. They haven't done anything wrong. Regardless of what you think about the tax policy and quote-unquote rich people not paying taxes, which itself is a fallacy. Set all that aside for a second. The fact is they haven't broken any laws. So what moral right do you have to steal their money, regardless of the fact that they have more than you? All that is a policy that's based on greed and envy, Merrill. That's all it is.
And with most assets, we can look in the checking account, we can look at how much money I've earned during the year and so forth. Those are pretty hard numbers. But with a wealth tax, you may have stock, so you can sort of see what that value is. But you may have things that are your house. Do you have to go out and get an appraisal because is this going to be based upon your house? A lot of people have homes that are paid for, and they have a lot of net worth based upon their house. They may have art or other. They may have an old car that they have around that has, if you had an old Mustang from 1967 or something, that may be worth some money now. It's amazing to me how you even come up with a valuation on those things.
Well, you make a good point, Merrill, and a direct analogy is the estate and gift tax. That applies when people die if your estate's above a certain value. And here's the thing. Only 1.5% of all federal revenue comes through the estate and gift tax. And there's only a few 100,000 estate and gift tax returns filed every year. But the estate and gift tax has the highest incidence by far of tax audit of any other class of tax return. And most people don't realize this. Almost 60% of all the estate tax returns that are filed are audited by the IRS for exactly the reason you just said. Is your business really worth X? Is your house really worth X? Is your investment account really worth X? And of course, the IRS takes the position that it's worth much more than the decedent's estate claimed that it was worth, and so they go in and they audit these assets, or they audit these returns rather, and challenge the value of the assets. And the IRS, of course, across the board takes the position that the assets are worth much more than was reported on the return. Well, Merrill, we're going to have this going on, potentially hundreds of thousands of times or even millions of times every single year. Apart from the cost of individuals to comply with this, how much cost and administrative hassle is it going to add to the IRS to be able to audit these tax returns for all these values, Merrill? It's a monster that's just waiting to be released.
My guest for this hour is Dan Pilla, founder, executive director of the Tax Freedom Institute, and we're going to be taking your calls if you have questions about that. And, of course, the tax bill was signed in December 2017. I think some of those provisions didn't actually go into effect until 2019, and that's the tax season that we're looking at last year. So if you have questions, 1-800- 351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you have questions for Dan Pilla. When we come back, we want to raise the question of what should we be considering this year as we head into tax season to make sure that we're doing the right thing and don't get in trouble with the law. So if you are interested in asking a question with Dan, 1-800-351-1212. And this is Merrill Matthews. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
In this highly politicized culture, we see that more and more people are called racist. Dennis Prager has been watching this and even seen the label used against him. His commentary not only tells his story, but provides some insight on why the left calls good people racist. After he spoke at a Turning Point event, the vice provost for diversity at Purdue University claimed that Prager said slavery was not bad. Dennis Prager explains that he never said anything remotely like that. After he mentioned it on his radio show, the provost wrote to Prager and suggested they meet, but offered no apology. Prager provides another example from his radio program where he mentioned some of the offensive words used by President Truman. A listener called to ask why Prager would repeat one offensive word but not use the N-word. He merely replied that the left has rendered the N-word the only unutterable word in the English language. Days later, news stories surface claiming that Prager said it's idiotic that you can't say the N-word. Prager believes that there are two major reasons why the left smears with the label racist. First, truth is not a left-wing value. Truth, he explains, is a liberal value and truth is a conservative value, but truth is not a value of the left. As we've discussed in previous commentaries, he makes a clear distinction between liberalism and the left. Second, smearing opponents is not only a left-wing value, it's a standard operating procedure. The left does not win through argument, it wins through smear. Making a well-reasoned argument in the public sphere, and you will be smeared with the label racist, sexist, bigoted, intolerant, homophobic, Islamophobic, or xenophobic. It's easier to call someone a racist or a fascist than to make a reasoned argument. That's why the left does it. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From CBN Films, I Am Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland. I Am Patrick in select theaters 2 days only, March 17th and 18th. IamPatrick.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and on the phone with me, Dan Pilla, our go-to person on all things tax. Dan, you know, not everybody has stocks, but a lot of people have them in 401ks or so forth. But, you know, you kind of hope to make it through the end of the year. You've got a long-term capital gain there, and you may have to pay some taxes on it. But with the gyrations in the stock market right now, today the Dow's down about 1,900 points as I speak. We may be looking at some long-term capital losses. What's the difference there in terms of tax purposes?
Well, the difference, Merrill, primarily is capital gains or losses, for that matter, are taxed differently than ordinary income. And this is one of the arguments that the left obfuscates very, very seriously and significantly in helping the average person understand tax policy. Capital gains are at the core of that obfuscation. But let me very quickly say this. When you have a capital gain, when you invest in some kind of an asset or a business that returns a gain to you, stocks, those kinds of things, then they're taxed at a certain rate. They're not taxed as ordinary income, subject to the various brackets that we have. All right. If you've got a capital loss, however, now when you get that capital gain income, let's say you score in the stock market and you make $15,000 on a stock trade. Well, first of all, God bless you. Secondly, all of that $15,000 is taxed as capital gain income in the year that you incur the gain, the year that you realize the gain. Now, on the other hand, if you have a capital loss, let's say you invest in a company and it goes south and you lose $50,000. Well, the government at that point is not there to slap you on the back and pass you the tissue and console you with your losses. What they do, in fact, is they significantly limit your losses. You can only claim $3,000 a year in capital losses right? Whereas your capital gains are fully taxed in the year that you receive them, unless you got losses that can offset gains. So, for example, if I had $5,000 worth of losses and $15,000 worth of gains, I can write off all my losses against the gains, all right? You understand? So the gains are reduced. But if I don't have those gains, Merrill, then that capital loss, whether it's $10,000 or $100,000, has to be spread over the future $3,000 at a time. So the government is there with its hand out when you hit the lottery, but when you lose, you know what? They're nowhere to be found. and this is one of the nefarious parts of the Biden plan, quite frankly, is he wants to take all capital gains and treat them at the same rates as ordinary income for certain taxpayers, but there's no proposal to change the loss limitations. All right, it's one thing if we want to treat those gains as ordinary income. You know, there's some economic debate back and forth as to whether that's a good idea or not, and honest people can disagree as to whether it should be this way or that way. All right, there's no quarrel there. But if you're going to treat them all as gains, you got to treat all the losses as immediately deductible as well, because otherwise we tip the playing field even further against business investment. See, this is the problem with treating capital gains like ordinary income from an economic standpoint is you discourage investment, Merrill. And we have to, one of the reasons why we've got such a robust economy up until the coronavirus has poisoned the well here a little bit, so to speak, one of the reasons is because of the treatment of capital gains and the way the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act treated business income. It has encouraged investment. It's encouraged businesses to hire employees and to make investments in tools and equipment and inventory and facilities and so on. This is what drives the economy, and this is what creates jobs.
1-800-351-1212. If you have a question for Dan Pilla, 1-800-351-1212. Dan, we've got the president signed the tax bill in December 2017. I think some of that didn't actually take effect until 2019. And of course, that's the year we're talking about. What should people be thinking about, especially if are there some new things from the tax bill that they should be considering as they get ready to pay their taxes?
Well, one of the things, Merrill, in particular, that took effect in 2019. Most of the other elements took effect in 2018, but one of the key ones that didn't come into effect until 2019 is the suspension of the penalty for not having government-approved health insurance.
Yes,
right? There was a penalty for that based on a percentage of your income, and that penalty has been suspended. So anybody that hasn't gotten government-approved, which is just it's just an anathema, isn't it, to say government-approved health insurance? To anybody who hasn't gotten government-approved health insurance now is not going to be penalized. Now I will say this. Here's an important function, and this was true for 2018 taxes. It's true for 2019 taxes. It's true for 2020 as well. The withholding tables were changed, Merrill, for all employees around the country. About 85% of all taxpayers are employees, approximately. Not quite 85%, but north of 80% for sure are employees working for somebody else. All right? Those folks have money taken out of their paychecks for their taxes. Now, when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act took effect in January of 2020, those withholding tables were changed. So the IRS reduced the withholding tables, that is to say less money was taken out of your paycheck every pay period to reflect the lower tax rates. All right, so you want to look at your withholding here now on the threshold of 2020 to make sure that you've got the correct withholding going through 2020 for two reasons. Number one, you don't want to overpay because that means you're giving the government an interest-free loan for longer than a year, right? By the time you get your refund, it's over a year. And then on the other hand, you don't want to underpay either, Merrill. You don't want to be in a situation where you file your tax return in April and now you owe the IRS a surprise $5,000 or whatever the number might be, and you're flat-footed because you didn't save the money. So you want to look at your withholding situation right now, early in the tax year for 2020, so that you've got the proper withholding going forward so you're not blindsided at the end of the year.
Do the tax tables, because when you're working for an employer, they tend to look at your income and take out some type of estimated tax for the FICA tax as a way of saying, you know, the human resources does that for you typically. So do you are we generally correct on that? I mean, do the tax tables generally reflect that accurately so that you get back about that, or is it? I mean, most people I can recall tend to have, there's more taken out than they need to, and so they're hoping for that refund at the end of the year, but they could also change that, and that seems to be, the tax tables seem to actually overpay.
Yeah, you're exactly right. If you just simply go by the tax tables with a W-4 that's got, let's say, that provides for the lowest threshold of withholding, you're going to be over-withheld significantly and get a refund. No question about that. Now, what's changed this year with the 2020 W-4 form has caused, frankly, a great deal of confusion, Merrill, because the IRS completely rewrote the W-4, and I don't know why they did that. I'd like to meet the individual that did it. I'm going to kick him right in the pants is what I'm going to do.
I'll hold him.
Okay. Now, listen, there was no good reason why the IRS had to rewrite that form from cover to cover to make it so confusing as it is. But the bottom line is this, that the employee still has the ability and the right, I should say the right, to submit a withholding statement to his employer that indicates on that statement whether there should be more or less withholding. And there's a calculation on there that I'm not going to try to explain on the radio, but you work through the instructions on the form, and it'll lead you through the calculation that will tell you what kind of numbers to put on that W-4 to allow you to match your withholding to your tax liability. That's the goal, Merrill, is have the withholding match the tax. So at the end of the year, you don't have a big refund coming back, but nor do you owe the IRS a bunch of money either. You're at as close to net zero as you can be.
1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to talk to Dan Pilla. Dan, the tax law was supposed to try to simplify our taxes as well. I got the impression they didn't simplify it as much as I would like them to. Is it much simpler than it used to be?
Well, it isn't any simpler than it used to be, Merrill. Frankly, I mean, this is the quite honestly the fraud of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. For the most part, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is a good tax cut measure. That's what it is. It reduced taxes, the bottom 80% of income earners, that is to say let's say the poorest 80%, let's put it that way, got a tax cut, all right? Only the upper 20% of income earners saw their tax liability stay the same or go higher. Now, those are documentable facts. You know that as well as I do, right? That's just simply across the board provable facts, regardless of what the left says. But it didn't make the tax law simpler. There's just no question about that. They told us it was a postcard tax return, Merrill, but that was a sham because all they did, the Form 1040 had about 79, well, let's call it, just to make the math simple, call it 80 questions, all right? The previous Form 1040 had about 80 different questions that broke down into various categories for your adjustments and your withholding and your, this and that, right? So all they did was they removed about 70 of those questions, and they left the 1040 with plus or minus 10 very simple questions: name, address, Social Security number, all that stuff. And you think, oh boy, this is easy as pie. All those other 70 questions are gone. No, they're not gone, Merrill. They just moved them to 6 other forms. So now you got to work. Now you got to work through as many as 6 other forms to complete your tax return that we didn't have before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It really is a sham in that regard.
1-800-351-1212. Stay with us. We'll be back in a minute.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and on the line with me this hour is Dan Pilla, who is able to answer all things tax. 1-800-351-1212. If you have a question for Dan, 1-800-351-1212. And Dan, we've got a caller here on the line. Let's go to Connie in Illinois. Connie, you're on the line with Dan Pilla.
Hi. I was calling. I wanted to know, I started drawing my Social Security and my pension in 2010, and I do taxes every year, and I never have to pay when I don't get a refund. When can I quit doing my taxes?
Well, you don't have to file a tax return. That's a good question, Connie. You don't have to file a tax return if the income that you receive is under the value of your standard deduction. So if just for example, if you're married filing jointly, the standard deduction is about it is $24,000 for husband and wife. And so if the combination of your joint income is under that, you wouldn't have to file a tax return. For a single person, I believe the number is $12,400, and so that's what you need to look at. Now, your Social Security typically is excluded from that calculation. Here's what you need to do, Connie. The IRS has a publication called it's publication 5, Your Income Tax. It's called Your Income Tax. It's on their website. They've got a section in that publication that addresses the question who's required to file a tax return. And you can just look at the chart and see how it charts out based on your circumstances, and you can determine from there whether you got to file or not.
Okay, great. Thank you.
A great question. And so, Dan, just so I understand this, if my income is below the standard deduction, I would have thought I had to fill out tax reform and point out that my income was below the standard deduction, but you're saying I don't even have to do that.
No, you don't even have to do that. The only way you would file a tax return, Merrill, under those circumstances is to get a refund of your wage withholding, all right? So just for example, let's take high school kids that are out working summer jobs. They make $2,000 or $3,000 over the course of the summer. They have a couple $100 withheld. They probably don't have an obligation to file the return, but if they don't file the return, they aren't going to get their refund back.
Mm-hmm. Dan, let's turn to the SALT tax, because before we went to the break, we were talking a bit about income tax for higher income people going up, because in the legislation, in the tax reform bill, they had what we call the SALT tax, the state and local taxes, and because they put a cap of $10,000 on that for your deductions for state and local taxes, an awful lot of higher income people end up having to pay more in tax. And the amazing thing about this, Dan, is that even as Democrats were criticizing this plan as being a sop to the rich, they were complaining, especially if they lived in a blue state, trying to reverse some of those elements because they're having to pay more taxes as wealthy people.
Isn't that ironic, Merrill, that one of the key features of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act put a cap on the amount that the high-income people can deduct for state and local taxes, which increased their tax liability, of course, right? Increased their tax liability and now forced these higher-income people to look at their residence situation. Why am I living in a high-tax state and paying through the nose these high taxes that I can no longer deduct off my federal tax return? Why don't I migrate to a low-tax state? And so what we've seen over the last couple of years is significant migration out of places like New Jersey and New York into places like Texas and Florida, which have no taxes. Even President Trump made a run for it. He changed it. He changed his residence from New York to Florida here last year, and is probably going to save about 12.5% between New York state taxes and New York City taxes on his income, which of course is significant. And now, people like Governor Cuomo are crying that we've got to have this SALT tax limitation removed so that high-income people can continue to get their tax deductions. In other words, he wants a tax cut for the rich. This is just astonishing to me because the numbers indicate, Merrill, and these are documentable facts here. The numbers indicate that 96% of the benefits of repealing the SALT cap would go to the top 20% of income-earning households. All right, so they don't mind, the leftists don't mind championing a tax cut for the rich if it'll keep rich people in their high-tax states paying high taxes.
And California even toyed with the notion, and maybe New York as well, of calling tax contributions like a contribution to a nonprofit so that you could continue making those deductions because they were saying it was going to be a nonprofit. Now, the Treasury Department, I think, came up and said, we're not, you ain't fooling us. We are not letting you do that. But California, I think another state or two were looking at some kind of way to finagle around this so that they didn't have to pay the higher taxes for their high-income people.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and the analogy that you gave is precisely correct. There were 5 or 6 states that were considering these so-called tax-exempt organizations, which I wrote an article on that as soon as they floated that idea, and I said it was a scam based on all the settled law of charitable contributions. All right, first of all, there can't be any economic benefit to the individual in return for the contribution. Well, this clearly was a scam to do an end run around the SALT cap, and everybody knew it, including the states, because that's how they build it. And you're right. You're exactly right. The Treasury issued regulations that said they're not going for that.
Are there's some other changes in the 2019 law or other things that our listeners should be thinking about or being careful about?
Well, here's the thing that's most important, Merrill, and this is true for our, especially true for our small business listeners here. And I know Point of View has a great deal of small business listeners here, and here's the thing they need to understand: about 65%, roughly 2/3 of all the problems that small businesses have with the IRS are generated by poor record keeping. All right, the small businesses aren't tax cheaters. They're not circumventing the law. They're not hiding their income. They're not doing any of these things. What's happening is they're not keeping their records properly. So the best advice I can give to any taxpayer in general, small businesses in particular, is make sure you're keeping the proper records to maximize your deductions. For small businesses, one of the biggest deductions they have is their travel expenses associated with the business use of an automobile. Mm-hmm. It's a huge deduction for most businesses, and Merrill, I've been involved, as you know, in thousands of business tax audits over the 40 plus years that I've been working with IRS litigation issues and helping people through audits. I've seen thousands of audits, and almost every single small business audit I see, the IRS attacks the mileage deduction on the tax return, knowing that the vast majority of small business people simply do not keep the proper mileage logs they need to support their deduction. So in my book, Dan Pilla's Small Business Tax Guide, I spend a great deal of time, Merrill, showing people how to keep these proper records, not just for mileage, but for all business expenses, so that if you have an audit with the IRS, you're not going to be blindsided. You're going to be able to prove that your tax return is correct, and you're going to avoid paying taxes that you don't owe, along with penalties and interest that will could cripple you.
Now, of course, we talked the last time I had you on. We were talking about your small business tax guide that you have available right now. For our listeners, if you want to find out more about Dan Pilla, you can go to pointofview.net. We have his bio up there and a link to him. But Dan, do you have a link to that book on your website?
Yeah, I certainly do, Merrill, and my website is taxhelponline.com. It's all one word, no spaces of any kind, taxhelponline.com, and you can see all my material, including the Small Business Tax Guide, right there on that website.
If we're starting to make plans, because tax time makes us start thinking about next year as well, what should I be thinking about that I'm doing right now so that I'm properly prepared when we get to the end of the year?
All right, couple things. We touched on record keeping already. That's critical, no question about that. The other thing we touched on briefly, but let me pound on that for just a little bit more. If you're a wage earner, you got to set up your withholding properly so that you don't have either over withholding or under withholding, and that's through the Form W-4. Self-employed people, Merrill, don't have the quote-unquote luxury of having wage withholding. They have to make estimated payments of their tax liability throughout the year. And this is the one common area that I see, again, in my litigation work where small businesses get themselves in trouble. They're not making their proper estimated payments. So when it comes time to file their tax return, they got this huge tax liability and they don't have the cash. So you have to get yourself set up on a system of creating an ongoing, a running profit and loss statement for your business, which is remarkably simple. It's not fancy accounting. It's just a simple matter of listing out your income, let's say, for the quarter, and all of your expenses by category for the quarter, figuring out what your profit is, and then applying a simple formula to determine what your estimated tax liability is based on that profit amount, and then you pay that into the IRS. You have to do this quarterly so that you don't get blindsided at the end of the year with a huge tax bill. This is where businesses fall short, and this is a critical step in staying out of trouble with the IRS.
1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to talk to Dan Pilla, we're getting ready to take a break, and we'll have him back for our last segment. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back for our final segment with Dan Pilla, talking all things tax. Okay, Dan, let's say I have just messed up, and I owe the IRS a lot of money that I just do not have. What are my options?
Well, let's talk a variation here, Merrill. If you've got a situation where it's April 15th and you know you're going to owe the IRS a relatively small amount of money. Now, the definition of relative can only be answered by the individual in question, right? What's a small amount to me is different for everybody. All right, so that's based on your perspective. But here's what's important. if you owe the IRS a small amount of money that you reasonably think you can get paid within 6 months period of time, I'll talk about Plan A. Plan A is to use IRS Form 1127, Form 1127, is called an application for an extension of time to pay the taxes. Now, this is very confusing, Merrill, because most people think that when you file an application for an extension of time to file the tax return, right, when you submit that application, you get an extension of time to pay your taxes, but you don't. All right, the filing extension is Form 4868. That gives you 6 months to file the return, but the tax still must be paid by April 15th. If you can't pay the tax on April 15th, the Form 1127 is called an application for an extension of time to pay the taxes. That can get you up to 6 additional months to pay the taxes without penalties. And this is critical because, again, even if you got that filing extension in place, the IRS is still going to charge you with failure to pay the tax, which is a penalty of up to 1% a month, capped at 25% plus the interest. So it's a huge problem. All right, now, if you can't pay within 6 months, all right, you owe too much money that you can't pay within 6 months, then you got to go to Plan B. Plan B is Form 9465. 9465, Merrill, is called an application for an installment agreement, all right? And so if you submit, and you can submit that form right with your tax return, and that will set the wheels in motion to get you set up on an installment agreement with the IRS. Now, here's the thing. If you owe less than $50,000 and you can pay in full within 72 months, then the IRS is very flexible about setting these agreements up. It's not difficult to do. But you also have to remember that the failure to pay penalty continues to apply, so you got to keep that in mind. Now, if you owe more than $50,000, then you got to go to Plan C, and that involves submitting financial information to the IRS to request different terms, and that can be done as well. I walk you through this. I walk the reader through all of this process in my book, How to Get Tax Amnesty, which is available on my website and the link through pointofview.net. So all of this stuff is laid out. Now, one thing I will say, I'll say there's even Plan D, Merrill. If you owe, this is the good thing about having 4 million words in the Internal Revenue Code, Merrill. There's always Plan B or C or D, right?
I'm glad there's a good thing about that.
There's always something you can do. If you're in a situation today where you are either unemployed or underemployed, and your personal financial situation is such that all of your income is consumed every month with necessary living expenses, and you simply do not have the capacity to make a payment, the IRS has the authority to declare your account as currently not collectible. And what that means is the IRS sets it on the shelf. They put it on the back burner. They push the hold button on your collection case, and they make no effort to collect from you whatsoever if you are currently not collectible. I call it the life jacket, Merrill, because it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't make the tax liability go away, but you're not going to drown either or get eaten by sharks in the process because your case is off the collection stove. It's on the back burner. They push the hold button, and so now you've got the opportunity to do one of two things. Either get back on your feet financially and make payment arrangements of some kind, or negotiate a settlement with the IRS where you reduce the liability to some amount that you can pay. You can pay a lump sum to the IRS, and then they wash out the balance of the liability. That's called an offer in compromise.
Let's say I'm doing a little better this year than I have in the past, and I've got a little money left over. So I'm thinking about opening an IRA. But then there's this Roth IRA. What are the benefits and the problems with both of them?
Well, first of all, you can make a contribution to an IRA. This is the only thing you can do this year in 2020 and still get a deduction for last year, 2019, as long as you make the contribution before April 15th and you designate the contribution to 2019, Merrill, you can actually get a tax deduction for it. Now, here's the fundamental difference between the two programs. Under a normal IRA, traditional IRA, you make a contribution. Let's say you put in $10,000. You get a deduction on your tax return for what you put in. It's subject to limit, so it might not be $10,000. But let's just say you put the max in, and now you get a deduction for that amount of money. All right. When you take the money back out again, now it has to be treated as ordinary income. So you get a tax deduction on the front end, but you have to pay taxes on the distribution on the back end. Right. That may or may not be a good idea. Depends how old you are and depends on a lot of other things. In the case of a Roth IRA, it's the opposite. You don't get a deduction for the money going in, all right? So it's after-tax money you put into the plan, but as long as it sits there for 5 years, at least 5 years, Merrill, when you take it out, there's no income on the distribution, either of the capital that you put in or the accumulations, the growth to the account, dividends, interest, and so on that you've accumulated over these years. So if you're really young, or even moderately young, generally speaking, a Roth is a better idea. Here's what we don't know, though, Merrill, and this is going to depend on who the next president is. The leftists for 20 years have been floating balloons about stealing IRA money.
Yes.
Right? And what I mean by that is they have said repeatedly that it's unfair for a certain segment of the population to have all this money invested in IRAs when we've got a national debt now approaching $20 trillion. We've got all these poor people out there that don't have any savings whatsoever. So it's unfair for a particular segment of the economy to have savings while the government's running these deficits to provide benefits to low or no-income people. So they have talked repeatedly, Merrill, about nationalizing these retirement account assets. So, is it going to happen? I can't say it will, but I'll tell you this, if the leftists absolutely have their way in all these things, they will steal the money at some point.
That is such bad news because they've looked at doing that for some time. And also Social Security. Bill Clinton, when he was president, looked at trying to take Social Security, or at least at that time, a number of the pension plans at the state level, the state pension plans were doing fairly well, whereas Social Security has been, and he thought, well, maybe we should just go out and co-opt those state pension plans and put them into Social Security as a way to kind of get a part-time boost from that. So you're absolutely right. You want to be careful about politicians getting your hands on these things. In fact, Merrill, there was a Treasury analyst in the Clinton administration that specifically was the first one to float this idea of stealing private pension revenue as well. Yeah, you never want to underestimate the ability of Washington to try to take your money, regardless of where that money is.
Well, unbelievable.
Dan, thank you so much. We've been doing this for a while, and you're always a wealth of information on the tax issues. And tell us again, if people want to get in touch with you, where do they go?
They go to taxhelponline.com. It's all one word, no spaces of any kind, taxhelponline.com.
And we can find out about your small business tax plan there, but also there's some help for us if we're just individuals looking for what we need to think about when we're going to when we're paying taxes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then my book, How to Get Tax Amnesty, is there. And I'll say this, Merrill, anybody that orders a book off my website directly gets a free 15-minute consultation with me personally and directly.
Heck of a deal. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us. And I want to thank our people in our office here, Doug and Steve, for manning the phones. They took good care of us. And Point of View will be back tomorrow. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. Come back, and we'll have another good program for you tomorrow.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kirby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.